Welcome to today's Sifted Talks, which is in partnership with Twilio Segment. I'm Daphne. I am Sifted's French tech reporter based in Paris, and I'll be your moderator for today's talk, which will be focusing on arguably one of the hottest technologies of the last 18 months that has been much discussed. Of course, I'm talking about AI. We'll be looking at how AI can work for businesses. I think we've been hearing a lot about the technology. There's a lot of excitement about the technology and what it can do for both consumers actually and businesses. But what we'll be trying to do today is get to the real kind of tangible way that you can make AI work for a business. So looking at what's the right technology, what are the right use cases, and then obviously how to build an AI strategy around that technology and those use cases to implement the technology within a company. We'll also be looking at what are the risks and the limitations and the challenges linked to deploying AI in business and how to mitigate these. Joining me for this session, we have Tony Yates, the VP of Engineering at Cry, a digital healthcare company. Tony has a lot of engineering experience in the healthcare sector, notably in the NHS, where you were, Tony, before joining Cry. We've also got Rafe Coburn, the Chief Product and Technology Officer at Depop, so also more on the products and engineering side of things. Depop, I guess, doesn't really need to be introduced anymore. It's a fashion resale app for people to buy secondhand clothes. We've also got Simi Lindgren, the founder and CEO of Yoti. Yoti uses generative AI to recommend hyper-personalized products to customers in the beauty industry. And we've got Yulin Lee, the Chief Product Officer at Onfido, who led the product design and strategy teams at Onfido, which is an identity verification company. So we've got 4 panelists who are doing work with very different companies and very different sectors in relatively different teams, although there are some similarities, but all are using AI in some way. So hopefully you'll leave this talk with a bit of wisdom and best practice about how to apply those learnings in your own business or your own team. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please submit your questions throughout using the Q&A function. These will be upvoted and then we'll discuss them. We'll discuss the most popular ones that have been upvoted. There will be no standalone Q&A section at the end of the discussion, so we'll take questions throughout. So please do submit in the Q&A box. I'll get started with kind of an introductory question to get a good idea of the state of things. As I said, we've got 4 panelists with different sectors, different companies, different teams. But it would be good if you could kind of talk us through how each of you uses AI in your work. What are the use cases where AI makes the most difference? Just so that we get a better idea of how actually AI is a tool that you use for your business. I'll let any of you jump in first, or I can select if no one does.
I don't mind going.
Okay, let's go for it.
So how are we using AI? I guess there's a couple of different lenses for us. There's how we use AI to do engineering, which we're using Copilot. I think a lot of engineering teams are using that now. And only last week, I did a little audit on the entire engineering team to work out, if we took this thing away, would it make a big difference? Is anybody using it? Is it worth the investment that we're putting in there? And most people, in fact, all engineers were like, no, this is good. Please don't take it away. We love it. So it's definitely having an impact on the engineering side. But then comes the healthcare side. So the clinicians, we're using it for supporting nurse chat. So nurses having interactions with patients, and that enables them to have more conversations asynchronously than they would be able to handle if we didn't have some suggestive AI in the loop. And also to support with clinical coding. So when our clinicians do consultations, we ultimately need to record structured coded data, which then ultimately ends up in a patient's medical record. And we're using AI to suggest some of the coding, whether that's ICD-10 or SNOMED coding in healthcare, to suggest some of those codings. And like I say, it's human in the loop. Accuracy is of the utmost importance. But those are the big use cases. I think we've done something like 1 million ICD-10 coded suggestions that have been accepted to date, around 700,000 nurse chats. So it's having a big impact on the clinician workflow and the overall efficiency and quality of the data that we record about patients.
Julian, were you going to jump in as well?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So I think we're using AI in a couple of different ways. So on Fido's core product, which is the product I guess we sell, is an AI embedded product, or I think we used to call it a computer vision embedded product, and has been from the beginning. And so the core product development itself leverages a lot of the latest technologies that have come out. We've historically always built our own models, but actually now there's other things out there as well, so we can be smart about what we develop, what we use, what we change, what we test, etc. And then also therefore leveraging the latest in AWS and how to deploy AI models or smaller models, bigger models. So there's a lot of the core product itself, but that's quite unique to Fido because that is our product. I think outside the product itself, I know from a product and engineering team, yes, the engineering team also, I think as Tony said, it is a great co-pilot for people to do development. And that's definitely, I think, is speeding people up, or at least taking away some of the mundane stuff and the previous Stack Overflow Googling. I think even on the product side, we're seeing it built into a lot of the products that we use. So we use the classics like the Miros and the product boards and the dovetails and so on. And you do user research, right? A lot of this is like, 60-minute recorded phone calls, and now you can use AI to summarize point. I mean, I think there's still a lot to be said for doing it properly, but there's definitely ways that you, even as a product manager, you can speed up the stuff that you're doing. I know when we're building presentations, doing images, icons, there's just so much for the typical tech worker, and some of these are actually just being introduced in the products that we already bought, like the software, and that just takes, I guess, the efficiency. And then on the go-to-market side, I think there are similar products that they're using, right? And one of the things that also our products that our front end is used in like 44 different languages. We support just quite a lot. We have to support quite a lot of things. And we're not at the point yet where we're putting that through the AI system, but I can totally see that as the next thing, right? Supporting a website in 7 languages, supporting SDKs in like 44 languages and so on. Currently that's still quite expensive, but I can definitely see that on the horizon, as well as some of the typical sales stuff. So I think it is quite an interesting AI journey, because there's some stuff that we're incredibly sophisticated because it is our core product. And there's other stuff that we're sort of just using what's off the shelf or what's embedded into products that we buy.
Still testing as well, I'd imagine, yeah.
Oh, I can jump in next, I guess. So, as mentioned, Depop is a marketplace, and so I think and it's a consumer marketplace for the most part, and so we kind of use it for the really classic marketplace applications, search, recommendations, trust and safety, fraud detection, that sort of thing, detecting counterfeits. So, and honestly, that kind of like price prediction, I think those things are all like very traditional kind of predictive AI use cases. But honestly, it's still the bulk of what we do. It's we keep getting better at it. I think, we have not. And then when we think about pulling like kind of LLMs into our models or image processing, we don't really use generative AI for images yet, but for the language models, and mostly we use it to add metadata and save effort for our sellers. So it's like you have to, on any marketplace, you have to upload a photo, you have to describe what the product is, you have to add some properties to it. And so we've had a lot of luck assisting the sellers by using generative AI for that stuff, generating descriptions, identifying the brand, other things like that. Some of it's processing the description, some of it's processing the images, but very much on the kind of seller efficiency and quality of inventory point of view. And then, like everyone, we have a couple of, we're using generative AI internally for helping engineers. I think, it's been interesting to me. I think some engineers really take to it and others kind of don't. There's not been any kind of mandate. We just sort of make it available. And so, and then maybe the last thing I'll say about it, and for sure, as also mentioned, there are a lot of tools that are building AI in as an additional feature that we already pay for. Some of it's incredibly useful. Some of it's just kind of okay useful. And I think just kind of doing my job, I use ChatGPT a lot, and I find what I use it most for is to sort of get baseline briefing on topics that I don't know a whole lot about. And so, like I feel like with my CTO hat on, we're always discussing alternative pathways. Should we use an AWS service, or should we use an open source thing, or should we use this? And, ChatGPT is great at tell me the pros and cons of these kinds of things. I think, you almost, and I talk to people on the team as well, but they tend to have a point of view, ChatGPT doesn't care. And so it's always interesting to compare what ChatGPT says about technology versus what people say about it. And so, so just like for me personally, I feel like it's a huge productivity aid. Oftentimes I can skip a meeting by talking to ChatGPT for 5 minutes. And I find that incredibly valuable.
So for those of you who don't know what UT does, UT enables brands and retailers to drive sales, drive loyalty, and reduce customer acquisition costs. So I guess when we think about that from the beauty consumer's perspective, it's really our number one use case is being able to actually transform beauty consumers' experiences. And we respond, or UT responds, to inputs where the consumer takes a selfie. They're answering a series of questions on a questionnaire, and UT's models are able to, I guess, capable of learning from that data and make decisions based on that data to produce beauty recommendations. So that's kind of our first use case, which is to analyze and make predictions. And then the second use case would be to create new data. So I guess this is where we're leveraging GAN's models, which is kind of similar to the initial training data. And that's really important for us because when we're making beauty recommendations to consumers, they have different photo types, they look different. Pardon me. So we need to ensure that we have a robust and diverse data set that accurately reflects the beauty consumer population. So we are leveraging, GANs to be able to create synthetic data in order to ensure that it's learning from the underlying patterns and then kind of creating a mirror of the initial training data set. And also so we can comply with regulations as well, where we're not training our models on customer data always. So those are our main two use cases, Narrow and Gen.
Interesting. So I feel like there's the kind of product use case where it's a key part of the product you're offering to your consumer customers. And then there's also the operational side of things as well, where it's helping your teams work more efficiently. I'm curious as to whether as I said, the last 18, obviously AI has been around for more than 18 months, but the last 18 months have really kind of, I think, created an urge to get on board with the technology. For sure, from a mainstream perspective, it's so in the mainstream and everyone's on urge to use ChatGPT and these kind of things. As businesses, do you feel like at the moment you have to get on board with AI, you have to find the right use cases, you have to develop your AI strategy as fast as possible in order to stay competitive? Or do you tend to kind of try and take a step back and make sure that you do things as slowly as they need to be?
I can start on this one. I think, I would say it's kind of funny, I think, first of all, you kind of have to have an AI strategy that incorporates this to some degree because everyone expects you to. And if you say, I don't, you'll just it would sound strange to people. I think the catch, though, is that the rate of change is incredibly high. And so if you claim to have a 3-year AI strategy, you would be lying maybe to yourself because you don't know what's going to come out in terms of models that you can just use in the next 6 months, 9 months, year. And so I think kind of my approach to it has been make it really easy for people to use the new stuff that's coming out, whether internally or build it into products, just so it's front of mind for people, that they don't have to go talk to legal and get a bunch of permission if they want to try something new. I want people to feel super free to try things. We also, I would articulate that strategy probably externally as a sort of breadth over depth strategy. We want to kind of be on top of we want to surf the wave of innovation that's happening here. So we're doing open source LLMs, and we, can use GPT, and we can use Claude, we can use whatever teams, I think it'll eventually consolidate, but right now I'm okay with some fragmentation because the rate of change is high. And I think, maybe the other part of our AI strategy is, we need to continue to get better at the predictive AI that we were already using. That is still the bulk of what we do. And so it's kind of, don't get distracted by the shiny new thing. It is a shiny new thing. I think we see a lot of people incorporating it into their products in ways that are kind of a Me Too way. And I really don't want to get pulled in that direction. I know there are a lot of CEOs out there who are like, hey, why are we not doing LLM things when everybody else is launching new LLM products? And like, I still think everything needs to be tied back to a customer outcome, and not that's good. Like sometimes when people start talking about generative AI, I'm like, we're going to use generative AI to blank. I think it's useful to just like replace generative AI with computers in the same sentence. And if the sentence isn't interesting, it's probably not a great product, so I think the product use case always has to make sense. Anyway, I'll stop. This is a topic we could probably talk about for a while.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Rafe on that. I think, building an AI strategy is incredibly important. And first of all, does the business need it? What problems is, the business trying to solve? What metrics are going to be improved by leveraging this technology? Because not everything needs AI. And for our business, quite specifically, we had two problems that we need to solve. Everyone wants to have that personalized experience, and everyone's individual. So how do you match consumers with the right beauty products if you don't know who they are and then don't understand whether the product formulation will suit them? And then the other side, there wasn't enough data available for us to be able to train and make, allow a model to be able to make the most accurate prediction. So I think, when you're building an AI strategy, it's really just not assuming that AI is the answer, but choosing, what objectives are important for the business that needs to be solved. And then ultimately, is there enough data? Like in our case, like how will you manage the data? How will that feed into the product roadmap? And then what kind of, within AI, because I always like to say to people that AI is like the LVMH, and then machine learning, deep learning, everything is like the brands under LVMH. So it's like, what are the various AI technologies that can be deployed and used, and how will it allow you to reach those quite specific objectives?
I think I totally agree on this, like what our customer needs, right? As I said, we've been sort of building our systems for more than 10 years. Before these AIs, we still had to solve a customer problem, which was like, do you know who this person you are dealing with is online in a robust way? And as every new generation of technology has come along, like I think especially because we're a B2B business that helps businesses protect against fraud and so on, there's an adversarial component as well, and so you have to be on top of the latest technology because the other side is going to be on top of the latest technology. But it's not because you're fighting each other with like the technology is just the enabler of what people are trying to do, which is get into a system, stop people getting into a system. And so yeah, in some ways it's changed everything. In some ways it hasn't changed things at all. It's definitely made the other side more sophisticated, right? This democratization of being able to, generate deep fakes or whether it's faces or audio or pretend to be someone else, or like very sophisticated phishing attacks, and like all of these things in our world definitely has become more sophisticated. But then you've also got the tools which are more sophisticated. So we also use a lot of Gen AI to like balance our models and also make them like particular attack vectors, like be able to scale them and so on. So it does feel like, yes, of course you have to be on top of it. And the thing that I think for us as a B2B business selling into like financial and some other regulated ones is that for them, clearly been in business a long time. There's people who were buying it before AI came along. But I do think from that side, if you're not thinking about it, discussing it, or having a strategy for it, you will look very behind. So I think for technology vendors, especially quite pointy ones in certain ways, it's probably very good for business. It has driven more, I think what I've noticed in the last 18 months is also just like more maturity in the buyers. You can see that in the RFPs that come out, a lot more stuff on bias, security, privacy, etc., that are more specific to AI rather than just using things that were there before. So it's definitely pluses and minuses. It keeps it fresh, but it isn't about the AI, it's about the problem.
Yeah, so I think things are slightly different in my world. So obviously we need an AI strategy. Ours does tend to look a little bit further. So we do tend to look 2 to 3 years ahead, and that's usually because we're so heavily regulated. We have to evidence the impact of everything that we do in this space, especially if people are taking suggestions from AI and making clinical inference. So that's where the big risks are. It's kind of like the data that we're receiving and getting access to. It's really difficult to get that data. There's this like ownership problem in our world. Who owns the data? Is it the clinicians, like the doctors? Is it the system providers, or is it the patient themselves? And depending who you ask and what problem you're trying to solve and how much money there's to be made or lost in that situation will determine the outcome of the answer. So for us, it's kind of like understanding what data we could potentially use to give better outcomes for patients. And that could be detecting something, that happened in a patient's history way back when that you wouldn't see as a relatable thing when they're presenting with symptoms today, and would otherwise be missed. So there's some real good suggestive things we can do there. But then there's also the stuff that we curate. So as we're curating medical records, if we don't have a very high degree of accuracy, and then we're contributing to a patient's longitudinal record, then other people could take inference from what we've coded, and that could bring harm to patients. So for us, it's very highly regulated when it's affecting clinical care. But that doesn't stop us playing. So, our strategy is to utilize all these technologies, find out what their breaking points are, what they can do within our industry, who the people are we would need to include on that journey, who would be the regulators, who are the people that can stop us. And then ultimately, where does the funding stream come from? And I say that because in our world, it's not direct to consumer. It's not people parting with their own cash or B2B. It's usually some indirect healthcare provider who's holding a budget, who's looking for some kind of tangible saving. And in healthcare, it tends to be underfunded. So the money has to come from somewhere. So all that kind of does mix into a bit longer term strategy. We can't just kind of try, iterate and push things out as quickly as maybe other segments can. But that's not to say we're not. Like, we are doing some things. We just have to keep a human in the loop, and we have to make sure that confirmation bias is well managed, because confirmation bias in our world can be a killer. If a machine suggests something and people that kind of looks right and never question it, they can become complacent, and that's how bad outcomes can be achieved.
Yeah, so there's clearly like a sector by sector. There are very, very different approaches to the technology depending on which sector you're in. But what's clear from what everyone has said is that, well, you've all mentioned an AI strategy, right? Like, you have, from what I understand, it's not like wait and see where this goes. It's like be on it and be on top of things. Talking about AI strategy, so you've all kind of given pointers as to how to get started on that. Like, you've talked about focusing on outcomes, focusing on what problems you're trying to solve rather than focusing on the technology and then seeing what you can apply it to. You've talked about data, seeing what your data is. Is that so? Would you say that's like, would you agree that those are kind of the two places to start?
Yeah, I mean, I would. I mean, for me, data is a really tricky one. We have to include legal, we have to include various government bodies and assurance processes and things like that. So data is the really tricky one for us when it's data we're using for inference. So yeah, that's what I would say. That's the most important thing in the healthcare sector. Where is the data, and how do you maintain a high quality?
I would say the same as well. Whilst we're not making recommendations for, anything at like the prescription level, over the counter could exacerbate a pre-existing condition, or the consumer might just have a bad experience. So, us having a data strategy and ensuring that our new and existing data sets are able to provide the most accurate beauty recommendations is incredibly important. And we have to have, a human in the loop we say augmented intelligence. So there are dermatologists, estheticians, trichologists that are part of, helping to classify that data as well. And there is a data governance framework that we have to ensure that we're managing the data effectively. Because AI is data hungry and it relies on these robust data sets. And if we have insufficient access to data, and beyond insufficient access to data, it's been misclassified or there's been confirmation bias or anything else, it could really undermine the overall strategy and the business outcomes and the objectives that we want, which is to enable brands and retailers to drive those sales and build customer loyalty, and for consumers to find the right products. And also algorithms. I'd say algorithms is really important for us as well. I'd say second to data, I think algorithms is really important for us in terms of being able to, enable the machines to kind of learn, analyze, and even create data, as well as, make the best predictions. So that would be kind of the second thing that was kind of important for us at UT.
Yeah, I think. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that last one is the third thing that I think is really important, in that, ultimately what a lot of these, new models, new algorithms do for us is they either make things efficient to do in terms of how long it takes to build them that were previously inefficient, or like improve the accuracy of something to a level where that is useful as opposed to when it was as it wasn't useful before. So, if something can be predicted 90% of the time instead of 50% of the time, the product capabilities, obviously massively more open. And so I do think there's that kind of algorithms capabilities question, and staying on top of it, just so that you can kind of go back through the wish list of all the things you wish that you want to do for your customers, but were somewhat technically infeasible before. This is making these things feasible now. And so if you don't have one eye on kind of what these new capabilities that are emerging are, it's kind of hard to match them to those outcomes into your data, So we do look at that a lot, just like what's possible today that wasn't possible 6 months ago or a year ago. And then it's hard to extrapolate and say, okay, then what will be possible in the future? But even keeping up with what's possible now is kind of a big job.
Yeah, I definitely think, especially as a again, like I think in the B2B context, right, I would say the data and privacy side of it was we had to start investing really heavily with GDPR, because as soon as it came on, like you need to be able to trace every piece of data that goes in through the whole system, because you need to be able to delete it and propagate that through the whole system as well. So like, if I remember correctly, that's probably about 6 years ago, we made that really big investment. And hence have built the systems in that way. And obviously now, with hindsight, without that, I think like a B2B vendor, it would be very, very hard to actually implement AI into your core platform, because this is almost like an extension of that. So when we do product development, and also when we do strategy, like privacy and legal have really strong but privacy is part of the squad, as is legal, because of the sensitivity of everything that you have to do. They have a seat at the table. And I think that's the same with the AI strategies as well. It's quite a multidisciplinary thing, because it touches upon all of these different parts. And in that regard, probably we also are more cautious in terms of being able to just take anything into our system. I think if it's built into a platform and it's not sensitive customer data, it's very different. But if it's anything that's actually very sensitive, the development cycle of that is still slower. There's products that I probably would love to build, but actually have come into certain bits on it to do with like data management. But the other piece I think is incredibly important is just around systems in general. We also made a huge investment in like ML ops to be able to implement these models. I think it's partially is because for us, the models need to be very, 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 very accurate. Like when I think of some of the tools that I'm using, even though it's not, because it's a co-pilot, it doesn't need to be the most accurate ever because you've got a human. Whereas when it's actually the system making autonomous decisions, it has to be an extremely high level accuracy. You have to be constantly like looking at model drift and governance and all of these different components. And so the bar is set very, very high actually to do production ready products. And so I think there's a lot of buzz out there and people are trying POCs, but actually having like enterprise grade ready AI products, I think we're there in the journey, but it's taken a while to get there, and there's still going to be a lot of changes and a lot of quite heavy investments that people are continuing to do, and I wouldn't underestimate that as a company.
Okay, all great advice. You've mentioned a few tangible ways that this is a question that came from the audience that I think we've kind of touched on a little bit, but I'll put it to you guys in case there's something you'd like to add. The question was, how do you manage the security of personal and sensitive company data being fed to the LLMs you are using? I think, Yulian, you kind of touched on a few tangible ways. You mentioned like legal departments having a seat at the table and things like that. Is there any kind of advice that other panelists, or you didn't, if you've got other advice you'd like to give to answer that question?
Yeah, on a personal, I think one of the things we did with regards to this, and this probably started in that period, is we, maybe just because of the nature of what we do, like we have these very multidisciplinary product development squads. So it's like product, data, and applied science, and engineering, and privacy, and design is on this, is at the same table. And so this stuff gets ironed out very, very early. So it isn't, you can go and build whatever you want and then get it signed off by privacy at the end. For us, it's very much every step has privacy. And yes, it does therefore mean some products you get to go through some discovery, and yes, it's great, but the privacy side is, this is too sensitive, or we needed to build it in certain ways, and we kind of bring that into the beginning. So I would strongly recommend that if you're doing stuff regarding this, and especially if you want to like be able to later on to build it in from the process at the beginning.
Yeah, I think a couple of little practical ones on this. The first is, it just turns out we had pretty decent data governance already, in the sense that the expectation was that people would mark which fields have PII in them. That's kind of required, and so that's personally identifying information. I apologize for the acronym. So basically, we can say, okay, anything that is kind of segregated out as personally identifying information, we just don't bring it into this world. So that eliminates some risk. And then I think the other thing is, yeah, we've had pretty good luck trying out the open source LLMs. And so then you kind of get out of the like sharing data with the third party risk. If you're running an open source LLM on your own cloud or whatever, you know exactly where the training data is going, that you can delete it when you want to, and so forth and so on. And so that eliminates some of the risk. And my kind of overall feeling is the open source side is keeping pace with the commercial pretty quickly. I mean, it's not far behind. And so it's a pretty viable option for a lot of these LLM use cases as well.
I would echo what both Yulian and Rafe have just said as well. We have a thing called a DPIA, which is a data privacy impact assessment, and we have to do these whenever we put any product into production, and it changes the usage of data. So for us, it's kind of start with that. Don't do that at the end. Then you won't get any nasty surprises. The same again, legal team involved, clinician team involved very early. And also partners and potential stakeholders or customers, we involve them in the DPIA too, to try to get their perspective. Is this a step too far? Would this worry them? Can we think about how we might have opt-out features so people can decide, actually, I don't want to be subjected to the usage of AI, whether that's clinicians, patients, or partners. So all those things are super important for us.
Great. How does this apply when you're excited? So after you've kind of elaborated your AI strategy, identified your objectives, identified what your data is, clean your data, etc. There's obviously the implementation phase. And I'd imagine that involves working with third partners. So being based in France, I know that particularly in healthcare, a lot of health companies struggle with regulations around or like preferences around what kind of partners they can work with, specifically cloud vendors or like big US cloud vendors, that is not seen in a very positive light by regulators. Is that an issue that you have at all? How do you work with partners in a way that's as protective of sensitive data as possible?
For me, we've had this in both France and the UK, where complying with local, not local, but national, I guess, there tends to be some kind of like cloud strategy that's set by the NHS England or Department of Health or NHS Digital or similar. And in order to abide by them, we just have to have local presence. So the data doesn't leave France or the UK. it may be that the models are trained on premise or within those localities, and the results of that model sit somewhere else for production-based usage, but the data itself, we try not to, or we don't move that out of the local areas.
In general, how much, well, obviously you have to account for regulations, but I guess my question is, how do you navigate these regulations? And this came up in our prep call, Rafe. I see Yulian as well has something to add. Obviously, it's a bit of a tricky landscape, I'd imagine, if you're working in AI at the moment. How do you navigate that? How do you include that in your strategy?
Yeah, I think it does involve a lot of consultation with legal, what's allowed, what's not allowed. I think, and I think there's other, I mean, I think it may have been Yulian who said this earlier. It just kind of slows things down a bit, and I think one thing I've tried really hard to do is sort of make it an open field for using certain classes of data for certain things, so people don't have to ask about every single project. Generally, what I find with engineers, if they have to ask legal, they'll find something else to work on unless they absolutely have to do the work. And so I want people to feel free to kind of do innovative things. And so I think basically, like a good example for Depop, we have an advantage. We're like a consumer company, and so there's a lot of data that is publicly published. Like, it's probably already in the training data for all the LLMs, all of the listing descriptions on there, all of the photos people have uploaded. We have rights to use those in super flexible ways. And so, we can say, if it's data that can be seen by the public anyway, and you're using one of these LLMs that's been pre-approved by legal, and we tried to get a bunch of them pre-approved, then it's kind of do what you want. If you're getting outside that lane, then okay, we're going to need to meet with legal and figure the large things out. But I'm always trying to get just like a blanket permission to do some things to eliminate friction.
Yeah, I think because we're in some ways a reg tech, right? So this has been a journey through the whole existence of the company. Before AI regs, it was like KYC regs, right? And before that, and as part of that also there's cloud regs. So this is just this constant, every 2 years a new thing. It just seems right now there's a nexus of lots of different things, because there's the AI Act, the Biometrics Act, like DMA, the So right now it's very hot, but it wasn't that, like, this wasn't the case. There was plenty of regs and standards 3 years ago and 3 years ago and 3 years ago. I've quite a and we're also not just takers of the strategy, because just given where we are and in certain geos we work with the regulator, right, or like need to be certified, and a lot of these certifications are very new. Sometimes we're the first company going through the certification with this regulator in that country. So it's actually so we actually changed our product team structure so that we have a product compliance squad, and that's also very multidisciplinary in terms of product managers and solutions engineers and privacy and legal and regulatory affairs and so on. It's definitely something we've had to invest in quite a bit over the years. There is one for me, I think the silver lining there is that it's expensive to get there, but once you're there, I actually think some of the certainty will be helpful for the market. And we've really seen that in a number of markets, like including France. So in our world, when it was a grey area, or when the French regulator hadn't published exactly what their final draft was going to be, there was just a lot of uncertainty in the market, and obviously uncertainty makes deal cycles much slower and so on. Whereas now things are more formalized, actually the market's moving again, and people have just built products that work for that market, which is what we've done. We've completely got a now audited, certified track of the product, and then in markets where there's clarity, actually it's going really well, because now people are comfortable with buying software because they know they can take that to the regulator. It's got the audit. So it's a double-edged sword, but yeah, it's been a very big journey, and I think the next couple of years there'll still be a lot of moving parts as well.
Yeah, definitely. So would you, as a strategy, would you advise kind of complying with regulations on a like locality by locality basis, or complying by the strictest one out there, and then you're sure you're complying with all of them?
I think that's a very company nuanced decision, right? It depends on what like the total addressable market is and how similar they are, and whether there's interoperability between the standards, or whether there's likely to be, and which ones. We as a company decided, because a lot of these markets are incredibly important to us. But we have actually seen competitors go the other way, which is like move out of these very regulated, audited markets and just go into geos that are less so. My gut feel is in the longer term, there'll be more regulation as things mature, like they'll become a particular standard. But it's hard to say, right? And the interoperability, I wouldn't take for granted. There is definitely some between different frameworks, but again, depending what you're working in, it may not or may not. Obviously, I think if you build to a good standard and have the building blocks, then you can piece things together so you can go through these processes. But it's quite a like specific strategic question for every company, I think, to grapple with.
I think on the consumer side, we're kind of the opposite that you're talking about, which is, we just say, okay, what are all the applicable regulations, and can we build something that sort of complies with all of them, rather than trying to do that, especially because we do allow overseas shipping, and so if you have a buyer in the UK and a seller in France, then what is the applicable regulatory regime anyway? So it's usually easier for us to just try and have a one size fits all from a compliance perspective.
I'd imagine in healthcare that's probably doesn't work as well, Tony. Like, I'd imagine, because you've obviously got healthcare regulations on top of data protection, on top of AI. Like, it's a country by country basis, I'd imagine.
Absolutely, yeah. We have teams in each country to advise us on the regulations and how to interpret them. There is a lot of similarity,
Yeah,
I've learned that over the years, and I think you also get kind of a gut feel of what's acceptable and what's kind of in the gray area. And I always think of, if you try to stay on the side of what's sensible and acceptable, then you should have a much smoother path through the regulations. If you're really trying to stretch the boundaries of what's acceptable, then you'll find that there's a lot of people willing to stop you from going ahead. So we try to take people on the journey, as I mentioned before, and do the right thing. And the consequences can be quite high. The last thing we want is some kind of ill thought out pan-European governance framework that looks something like a cookie banner implementation that no one really likes. So we try to stay on the right side of things so people don't make decisions that are not so great.
sounds like good advice. You're kind of bringing us into another topic I wanted to discuss, which is beyond regulations. How much thought have you given to ethics in developing AI strategies? Would you say that's like a step further than regulations? Is that something that companies should be doing, or is it more of a nice to have? What's kind of the thinking around ethics there? I see you smiling.
Well, I was smiling because I was thinking about, the fact that it could be a nice to have. And for us, it's kind of like the most important thing. I think everyone can appreciate like the hugely transformative benefits of AI, but we also have to think about, the potential unintended impacts that it could have on, the end user and the consumer. And I can't remember when it was, I was looking at kind of the EU's framework, the EU's guidelines for trustworthy AI, and then I was looking at various different companies. But it's something that we thought about from the very beginning, mostly because we were trying to ensure that we were building something that would allow any beauty consumer, irrespective of their race, their gender, whether they had non-traditional facial landmarks, to be recognized and matched to beauty products. So we were always thinking about these various different aspects. And then when we began creating data, it was, obviously we touched on kind of the fact that in order for us to be able to create data, there was that risk of potentially exposing personal data and making sure that there was a place for consumers to be able to delete their data. But we had to think about whether, this data could be manipulated, or whether we infringed on potential copyrights, or the person's own rights over their own data, and whether we were both joint data controllers, and what, even for the mere fact that we generate 1,000 images every 108 minutes, the environmental impact of us going down this route. So, you know, we think a lot about ethics on a daily basis at UT. As we said earlier, and I think Tony's the same, we have humans in the loop, again, to ensure that we're being incredibly responsible, that we're being conscious of, you know, data privacy, bias. There is governance instituted for that, so that there is some semblance of somewhere having accountability. And we're even transparent about how the data is acquired and how it's used. As soon as, you know, the end user is interacting with UT, even if they don't know it's UT and it's on a brand's website, straight away they're able to see, you know, how their data is going to be used, how it will be used to train the model to make this recommendation, and what happens 8 seconds afterwards. And then there's the whole societal and kind of well-being aspect, which is incredibly important when we think about the stakeholders that we're building with, when we're deploying and testing, you know, these models. Ethics is all up in kind of our business, all the way through, especially because, you know, bias can be incredibly damaging. And we think about it a lot from a bias perspective, because we don't want someone who has a cleft lip palate not to be able to receive, you know, a lipstick recommendation. Like, that's absurd. Or, you know, someone who has a specific phototype to be recommended a foundation or a skincare product that will just make them feel horrendous. So we're very conscious about these about ethics, period.
Yeah, I would probably say for us in that regard, especially with regards to inclusion, and where is that line, right, between like just like doing the right thing in the product and also where you're used. So we're pretty aware that a lot of our customers use us as part of their, like, you know, front door journey to letting a customer in or not. And so if you're not, if the product isn't built with like accessibility in mind, or if you have demographic bias of any form and therefore have different rates of acceptance or rejection for different groups, or even like support X number of browsers, or the way you think, like these things all actually become really important about people being able to access services. Well, one thing I've noticed, so about 4 years ago, we actually voluntarily took some of our data and went into the ICO sandbox so that we could use data in that sense for to actually just understand what our demographic bias was at that point. And then we published and wrote about it. And that was quite like a big deal at that point in time. And we were the first in our world to do that. 4 years on now, I see this in RFPs, right? You go and you do accessibility, it's totally the right thing to do. And then actually once you start working, especially with say like a big retail bank that has deals with the whole population, this again becomes actually really core to what they do and how governments and regulators look upon then, whether this is like really enshrined in the regulation or not is again a thing to do and part of their responsibility to the population. And so I actually have seen more and more of these things just over time become the market standard, especially for at least like enterprise grade software, and I imagine some of the consumer world as well. But it wasn't like, I think you have to make your investments before and think about these and have these discussions. And then I think Tony said pretty well, right? If you try to do the right thing within ISIN, actually, even if the regulation may not be exactly what you want is, you'll have a lot of the good building blocks for it. So that you can adapt your product. If you didn't build some of this in, or like, you know, getting consent or privacy, whatever, into the beginning, it's very hard to then try and ram this in later without a big impact on what you do.
Yeah, so just to come in on that one, like I think a really tangible example is, you know, in healthcare, you have a record associated with yourself, and that's longitudinal through your life. And up until now, it's been people that's been contributing towards that. It's been people that have been making decisions and people that have been coding, right or wrong. You know, there's still quality issues there, but it is people. And what kind of I get concerned about is thinking long term, when we have machines in the loop or machines acting on behalf of clinicians, then that data sitting alongside the human created data, and ultimately then machines in the future are going to take inference from that data. And for me, it's kind of like, how can we inform some of the ethical things? How can we inform some of the regulations? So if we're contributing to longitudinal data, that we're classifying that right now, where that came from, what kind of inference were being used at that time. So that can also factor into some of the safety elements that come much, much later down the line. So I'm definitely thinking like maybe 5-10 years there rather than next couple of years. But I think this is where regulation and ethics need to step up and do something very, very quickly in this healthcare industry.
Yeah, I think that the thing I'd add on ethics is, at least in our space, I think ethical AI and a good product, there's a lot of overlap. I loved Simi's answer, and I think, I double down on it to say that when you get the AI ethics wrong, you're either excluding some of your customer base, or you're mistreating some of your customer base, or you're giving them a suboptimal experience. And like, obviously, yeah, I think we want Depop to be great for everybody. When you let biases creep in, it's not great for everybody. The inferences are wrong based on factors that we shouldn't care about. And so I actually think the ethics problem is really hard. How do you really monitor this stuff? It's not so easy, but I do think it's really important. Just like, we want to feel good about what we're doing, but also just from a customer perspective, you're not doing a great job for your customers when you don't kind of correct for bias.
Yeah, going back to the outcomes again. We had a question from the audience, which was, how do you test your AI, given that a human in the loop can't test every scenario? Would anyone like to answer that?
I mean, I'll start. Maybe I'll say I really empathize with people who aren't consumer businesses with lots of traffic, because, for us, A/B testing is really central. I think you need a hypothesis, and you need to, like, I won't give a big speech about A/B testing, but I think, it's very hard to compare two different versions of a model. It's very hard to compare these things unless you can do some kind of A/B testing type of stuff. And then there's the quest to say, like, okay, do we have offline metrics for offline testing that are predictive of what will happen online? But I think I know there are other ways to do it, but A/B testing is the answer for us for the most part.
I think our applied science team would say that learning how to do the sampling in a reasonable, non-biased way is part of the IP of what they've been building. And so, yeah, we do QC of X% of the sample set, and there is a lot of sophistication on how that is created, because obviously we can't QC, well, we could QC 100%, but that would actually be quite crazy. And so there's a lot of thought that's going into that, so that is a really well-balanced sample, and therefore we can start catching things like drift and so on. But it's also just built into the processes. The applied scientists are responsible for the products and also how they perform, and there's a lot of regular testing of how the model drifts, if at all.
Yeah, for us it's very similar. QC, we do clinical audit. We do that across all our services, all our clinicians. We regularly just go in and take a sample size and investigate, does this meet expectations? Was it accurate? Did the human make mistakes? Did the machines make mistakes? It's the full audit, and we do that continuously. We have to do that in healthcare.
Yeah, echoing the same as everyone else in, RLHF. So that reinforcement learning through human feedback is incredible. That's another piece that we leverage here as well. So it's a lot. It can be hard, but it's in the long run, it's beneficial.
It's worth it. In the last kind of 5-7 minutes we've got left, I wanted to talk a bit more about the limits of AI. We mentioned at the start needing the right technology for the right use case, and some of you mentioned ways to ensure that the AI is working. I think, Tony, you were talking about asking engineers if the AI was working for them, and they were like, yeah, it's actually working quite well. How do you measure the success of your AI strategy?
I mean, it's feedback from clinicians in our space. We have some people that are so some people just prefer not to have it. Some people are just fast without it, so they're not really looking for efficiency gains. Whereas some people embrace it and are more trusting. So it's mixed. We go on feedback, and we have it's kind of our own user personas for internal clinicians, and we see lots of variance there. It's not one size fits all. That's why I said earlier on, we give people the option of turning these things on or off.
as a B2B SaaS company, I think your clients will come back and tell you pretty loudly if they don't like the products that they're paying for. And so, yeah, I think there's definitely, I think we're quite lucky in the regard that some of our clients are incredibly tech-first companies, and products just go faster and faster and faster, not just with AI, just in general, and will give you very, very tough feedback if it's not working. But so I think, yeah, it's a combination of our own internal thing and measuring outcomes, and then also feedback we get from our clients.
I think, for us, quite similar is that it's that kind of, are they seeing value, that feedback, that return on investment? I think if they're not getting the outcome, which is a recommendation for the consumer, but, having their customer acquisition costs reduced, or, an increase in their sales, then we'll hear about it from that perspective. But then also, I guess, the adoption rate is something that we look at. So there are various different metrics that we track, and we expect that not every single person that goes to a beauty brand's website will use this. On average, it's about 33 to 36%. So how many of those guys are leveraging, the personalization engine to find, have a better experience on the brand's website? And then we have customer experience metrics, that we communicate actually to our customers, the businesses, because it helps us to ensure that they will renew the following year. But in that personalization engine, we're also asking, the consumer, the end person, what's their experience been like? Just give us a score out of 5 or whatever else. So there's various different metrics. And then I guess model accuracy and efficiency, some of the kind of technical metrics that we judge internally to see that we're performing the way that it should as well. So yeah, lots of metrics.
Yeah, I think I'm kind of on the lots of metrics side of things as well. And I think to go back briefly to A/B testing, I think when we make a product change, whether it's incorporating a model or doing anything else, it's to change customer behavior in some specific way. And I think I really try and test that metric always. You test the broader ones too, but if we expect people to make offers more frequently on items, if we give a better price prediction, then what I want to see is that people are making offers more frequently, in addition, of course, selling more stuff. And so I think when you can get specific about that, you can actually get some insight into whether the thing that you built is really, really working. And I think in that sense, the AI stuff is not radically different than any other kind of product change.
Yeah, definitely. But I guess it kind of, proves the point that sometimes AI isn't the answer to everything, and it's not necessarily a technology for every single use case. Great. I think we'll probably have to wrap up around now, given the time. But hopefully this was a useful chat for our listeners. I think you were all quite clear on how AI is a big technology and does drive things forward, but obviously you have to implement it in a careful way. Data, it seems to be kind of the top of mind challenge, regulations and ethics as well. We sadly didn't have time to talk about things like talent and costs, but I'm sure that listeners can get in touch with us if they have any follow-up questions. So thank you to all who joined. Thanks to the panelists for their insights. Thanks to our partner Twilio segment for their support. Sorry if we can get to your question. We ran out of time, but again, please feel free to get in touch with us if you have any follow-up questions. Thank you once again, everyone. Have a good day.